Two friends,
Two pastors,
two theologians,
exploring God and the greatest mysteries of life.
unscripted,
I'm Dr. Wes Arblaster,
and I'm Dr. Ethan Smith.
and we are...
Mysterion. Damn, Mysterion. Let's talk about sex.
Let's talk about sex.
You guys gotta offend Jacob the intern.
What? Nah.
Jacob the intern is with us today.
Jacob the intern back there in the corner, man.
If we get thirsty later, we'll have him fetch us drinks.
We're talking about lust. You like the way I said that?
No.
Lust. You
I
gotta
don't.
roll the tongue when you
I'm
say
stuck sitting beside you for the next hour. I'm not excited about you saying it that way at all.
Yeah, this has been postponed for a couple of weeks, and now we're hitting it, and yeah. That was totally not meant to happen. So we'll continue on here. Yeah, so we're gonna be talking about lust today. It's one of the 8. Right?
It is one of the 8.
And you know what? Lust is something, if you think about it a lot. I mean, I grew up in church and went through church youth group, and lust was something that was talked about a lot.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, man, if you're going to be talking about ways that you can fall off the horse, lust was like the big one, right? Am I right?
It's true, yeah. By the time you hit junior high, high school, college, sometimes it seems like it was the only temptation we talked about, especially for guys.
That's right.
If only we could master this temptation, all would be fine.
What's funny though is when we get into the topic with Evagrius and all that, it's one of the early ones. So it's not the crown of the 8 at all. It's kind of like down at the bottom, right?
Yeah, so Evagrius discusses the 8 thoughts that lead to passions and sins, and in fact they're in ascending order of how damaging they are and how important they are in his mind. And lust is only the second one. The only thing he's less worried about is eating too much.
Yeah. Interesting. Fun fact.
Yeah. But I think, in our church culture, you have one or two things. Either there's like this obsessive focus on sexual sin, or you kind of get to a point and you just go, I give up.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's kind of our church culture. A lot of people are kind of familiar with this. And lust, our understanding about lust is sort of, we grow up with a certain kind of imagination about what it is, right? Shaped by church culture. Now, I remember, I was in, church youth group and all that stuff in the 90s. Late 80s, no, 90s. And then toward the end of the 90s, there was a famous book that came out, Why Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris.
Yes.
And this was like a big book, it was real popular. The girls carried it around. I remember being pretty freaked out in college when
I
you see a girl.
discovered that book in college. It was like a cruel joke.
Right, because you're going around, and if there's a girl holding that book, she's not game, so that was one of those things. It kind of sucked.
You're going to kill me this episode.
But anyway, Joshua
I am practicing
Harris
self-control this episode.
So Joshua Harris made the news lately because, you know what? A couple years ago, he's like, hey, this book that I wrote all about purity and how dating culture is bad and how you shouldn't kiss until you're married, and then you should court people, and how that leads to this true flourishing, not only marriage, but he emphasized how awesome sex life is if it's in that context. He said, that's not really true, and he actually wanted to retract the books. And then, it kind of blew up all over the internet last couple of weeks because he just basically came out and said that him and his wife now, who had gone through this courting process and it was supposedly going to give them, a perfect marriage, tragically, their marriage is ending. And Joshua Harris actually says he's kind of doesn't consider himself a Christian anymore.
Right.
So there's something going on there. As a lot of people have been writing about this sort of champion of purity culture, of sort of conservative Christian values, walks away from it. And they're saying, why? What's going on here? And, we personally don't think that it's completely separated from how we come to have views about lust and what we think we ought to do with them, and the failures of sort of our perception of that. So I don't know if you have any comments about that, but
sure. So I don't want to psychologize Joshua Harris or pretend to understand, but I do think you see these two these two moments, and sometimes some of us have lived through both of these moments of you're really into this purity culture stuff, and with these promises that come with it, and then you sometimes you just can't stick with it because honestly, a lot of it is fear-based and false promises and so forth. And even if you don't walk away from the faith altogether, like Joshua Harris, sometimes you get to a point where you're just like, I don't know. Hopefully Jesus has this handled in his grace, and you just don't want to think about it or talk about it anymore, precisely because a lot of that culture is so poisonous. So the way I think about it, it's connected to a broader issue where sometimes how we talk about our spiritual life and why we want to pursue purity or holiness is a certain picture of our relationship to God that is basically a codependent relationship where the only real problem with sin or, say, sinful pleasures are that God doesn't like it. And that's the end of the story. God is really the problem. And so, in that picture, God is pretty moody, easily angered. And his moods are sort of dependent on our behaviors. So we do this, and he's upset. We do that, and he's happy. And then for us, our survival and our well-being is dependent on God's mood. So we are sexually pure to keep God happy, and so he'll rain down blessings on us. And this kind of codependence. God's mood depends on our behavior. Our well-being is dependent on God's mood, and it's like that. And as I said, the real problem there with, say, sexual impurity is not that it destroys our lives or our relationship with God, but it's that God just doesn't like it.
Right.
And so some people come to the conclusion that the root of the problem is God. And so they walk away from God altogether.
Right. So there's this kind of thing where, especially, let's say in the hormonally charged teenager, where we're being told God doesn't want you to do this, God doesn't want you to do this, and your body, your hormones are raging and all this kind of stuff, and so you feel torn, what am I? I'm going to try to stay pure, try to stay pure, try to stay pure, and there's all of this stuff raging inside of you, and then, it seems like at that point, after time, after failure, after failure, after failure, you get to the point where it's like, this is what my body's desiring to do, and God seems to be just the one that's making my life miserable here.
And for no other reason than he just doesn't want you to do it.
Right. And part of that has to do with our understanding about what purity is, what actually we talk about purity and impurity. And to the point to where today, I think people, when we hear that word, it's almost a cringy word. Like, for some folks who are still really enmeshed in sort of conservative purity culture, it's like they're going to hold this up. Purity is the thing, and it's very much tied to sexual purity. And then for many, many people, and I would say increasingly, it's almost like, ew, I don't like that. And then you get people actually kind of going the opposite direction. And I've had conversations with people who are even in the ministry, and they say things like, oh, sexual impurity isn't really a thing in the Bible, and having sex, premarital sex, all that stuff, that we just created all that. And it's almost like they go the opposite extreme, and they just say, there's really basically throw up our arms, and God doesn't really care what we do with our bodies. And we kind of go from one extreme to that, in some ways like gluttony, right? One extreme to the other.
And I think people are caught in a bind. Like good-willed people are caught in a bind. We want to honor the scriptures and our traditions that say, what you do with your sexual desire matters. Scriptural authority matters. On the other hand, we recognize that all the ways these things have typically have been, how do I say this, enforced or stressed is kind of toxic. And I think for both of us, one of the things we want to say, what creates that bind, that almost no-win situation there, is the fact that sexual desire and questions of purity have been abstracted or taken away from questions about spiritual life.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it's in a scriptural and patristic context of spiritual life that maybe we can begin a way of talking about sexual desire that is integrated into our spiritual life, or into our life with God, so to speak, and that makes sense and is healing. It's not
Yes.
it's not the fear. It's not God is the problem. God just doesn't want you to have this particular bodily pleasure. But we can begin to understand why there are stakes involved in what we do with our sexual desires.
Yeah, so let's just say a few things about that. We've talked about this before in the last season, about generally the New Testament understanding of the human being and also the patristic understanding of the human being. We can basically simplify it down into the sort of three rings to the human person.
Yeah.
There's the outer ring, which is the body, and then we move into the mind or the soul, and then the very heart or the spirit is at the center of the human being. And every one of these aspects or dimensions of the human being is good and is created by God. But what has happened is our attention, our minds have been turned as a result of the fall, tends to be turned toward outward things, to bodily things. And so to be restored, made whole in unity with Christ, has a lot to do with turning our attention and our focus back toward the heart. And when we turn back to the heart, that doesn't mean we ignore the body, but the body now no longer is center stage, is no longer controlling, let's say our hormones, our appetites are no longer controlling our actions. They actually become transformed such that they are in harmony with our spirit. And that's important when we look at Evagrius, because Evagrius, of course, starts with the body, starts with gluttony, and then he moves on to impurity or lust. His word is porneia, which is this other aspect of bodily appetites, which again, just like eating, is a natural thing, right? That the desire for procreation, that kind of attraction, sexual desire is not that different from eating. It's part of what it means to be a human bodily creature. But what he's trying to do is say we need to discipline, we need to reorder that aspect of our lives. Our attention needs to, in some sense, be placed back into a life in the spirit, such that these desires, the control, the power, the influence of our bodily desires becomes, in some sense, tamed, in some sense, reordered toward the life of the spirit.
And that's important because God's not just one more creature in the world. And we're not just animals. The fact that we have minds and that we have this heart, this core to us that's special within creation, that's what allows us that special kind of fellowship with God. Because of who and what God is, we need our mind's attention, its ability to go into the heart, and not be dominated by the things of the body, not because the body is bad, as you just said, but because that is where we're uniquely made within the creation to have this especially close, intimate relationship with God. It's only in the heart, and the heart is especially designed for this, to directly experience and encounter God. And the issues with things like overwrought sexual desires, running amok, is it directs us out to the body and the body alone.
Yes.
And it's not simply that God says, ooh, I simply will not commune with you when you have this sexual impurity. But it's that God dwells in us. God dwells in the creation in a place that sexual desire run amok pulls our attention away from there.
Yes.
You talked about that threefold structure of the human being, body, soul, heart, or spirit. And if you go back and look last season, and I think if you look at the episodes on theophany, how to see God, 1 and 2, I think those are two of our better episodes. I think they're worth rewatching. And also the kingdom is within. Those are worth rewatching. But we talked there also how we are temples. Right? The body is the outer court. The soul is the holy place, and the Holy of Holies where God resides, God's revelation, where Christ himself is the Holy of Holies. And the human being is a temple, right? Body, soul, heart. So again, the idea is not that God simply doesn't want you there with him, knowing him, seeing him, if you're engaged in if you're getting this kind of sexual pleasure. He's not just doing that. The issue becomes people capable of going to that place where God resides, where God is revealed. So it's almost like sexual desire. If that occupies our mind all the time, we're drawn out into the outer court.
Yeah.
And in the outer court, God can only be seen very indirectly.
Right.
And the goal is to move into the holy place and into the Holy of Holies, which is the heart.
Right. Right.
And that's why we need to put these desires in order.
So yeah, and so just to use, look at it in Evagrius' own words, we see this, and this is in chapter 8 of the Practicus. It says the demon of impurity, and that word there is porneia. It's the same word that we're going to be looking at from the New Testament. Impels one to lust after bodies. And this is interesting. Again, the main point here is not just lust in general. It's this directedness toward the body.
Yeah, it's not, ooh, yucky, naughty. It's obsession with the body.
Obsession with the body. He says it attacks more strenuously those who practice continence in the hope that they will give up their practice of this virtue, feeling that they gain nothing by it. And that, well, let's just move on for a second on that and leave that to the side. This demon has a way of bowing the soul down to practices of an impure kind, defiling it and causing it to speak and hear certain words almost as if the reality were actually present to be seen. So it's interesting here. This is a sense that we're going to be lowering ourselves or bowing ourselves down to things that are impure, right, or defiled rather than holy. And there's this language there of temple, holiness, worship, that we're going to explore in the New Testament. But it's important to recognize what's actually happening here. It's not like, ooh, don't just, that stuff's just bad.
Just bad.
Yeah, just bad. Just don't touch it. The idea here is that we were made for a certain kind of life in relationship to holiness, sanctity, the presence of God, and lust, which is an improper ordering toward the body, sort of directs us away from that and degrades us as spiritual beings in that way.
Yeah, so that language of bowing down, that's fantastic because that takes us right to the Apostle Paul. We really want to draw a lot out of the Apostle Paul today to make clear how this comes from Scripture, this idea of spiritual life. But Paul ends up in the same place, right? He says these obsessions with the body, whether it be gluttony or porneia, sexual desire, sinful sexual desire, is idolatry.
Right.
Which is Evagrius' picture, this bowing down. You are outside of the Holy of Holies of the temple, and you're bowing down to something, which is to say something not God.
Yes, and just as we get into this, I want us to see this. Oftentimes these kinds of, I'm going to quote just for a second, verse 5, because I want us to recognize that oftentimes we read these lists of what Paul's saying, don't do this stuff, as just lists in the abstract, like, these are bad, don't do this. But you will see, actually, when we understand it in the context of what Paul is saying, these are illustrations of this much bigger picture about what we're called to.
And so, Colossians 3.
Colossians 3, verse 5, sorry. He says, put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly, fornication, that's that porneia word, impurity, passion, that's pathos, that's the word we've been talking about, evil desire, and greed, which are idolatry. I'll just stop there for a second. Like oftentimes in church, you just hear that list, like don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and it just looks like God saying, I don't like that stuff, don't do that. But
and then the language of idolatry is almost like just an image, a metaphor of you're too committed to that.
Right, exactly.
And I don't like it.
But actually, Paul's doing something much deeper, much bigger here. In fact, what he's really talking about is who human beings are and what's happened to us in and through Christ. And these are the kinds of things that he's saying, because of what you are becoming, these are the things that you should shed or leave behind. So I want us to kind of dive into the bigger picture that Paul's actually talking about here. But just to make that point, when you pull that verse out, you can turn it into a list. Just a list, a don't do list, a naughty list. But what's actually happening here is something much deeper.
And calling those things idolatry puts us back in that temple context.
Yes.
Back in the temple context, that bowing down to the wrong thing, something created.
So maybe what we could do here is, what do you think? If I read verses 1 through, we'll stop at 5, and then maybe we can kind of get into that context.
Let's do that.
Does that sound good? Or do you want to tell me?
Well, let's go ahead and read that, and then we'll comment off that. That sounds good.
Okay. So this is Colossians 3, 1 and following. So if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. And then he says, Put to death, therefore, or because of this, put to death whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. I'll just stop there for a moment.
Yeah. There is a lot in that to unpack.
Good stuff.
Try to have a sort of a good budget our economy of words here as we explore this. So Paul starts out with this idea of Christ is above, and so are we. And so we should turn our attention to the things that are above. And he contrasts that with the things that are earthly. Some translations obscure this idea of earthly, like just the stuff around us. So the question is, what is this above language about? Where Christ is, where we are, and where we should have our mind turn towards, right? That intermediate state in us, right? We've got that 3 levels: the body, the mind, the heart. And he says the mind should be turned above. What's interesting about that is earlier in the first chapter of Colossians, Paul uses all this inward language. Where is the great mystery, who is Jesus Christ, the glory of God? Where is he hidden? And he's hidden within you, within the heart. And here the language isn't within you, but above, right? And he's seated at the right hand of God. And I don't want to be unclear here. What's interesting here is as we go further in this, those two things turn out to be one and the same thing, right? Christ seated on the heavenly throne with his Father is both above and within.
Yeah, so let's talk about this a little bit, just to try to see how those are linked. And then maybe, it might be interesting just for folks that are like New Testament geeks, maybe we can get into a little historical context about what might be influencing Paul here. I'd love to have us talk a little bit about that. But before we do, just think about this. That above language, we've talked about this in past episodes. It's a spatial metaphor. It's like up. But what we've said before is that can't be literally the case, right? God's not literally above. And we've talked before about above or higher. That spatial imagery actually is a description of a kind of elevated status. I will have higher aspirations for you. So we might say the highest court in the United States is the Supreme Court. We don't mean it's above, situated geographically above everything. It's got the most authority, right? It has that kind. When we talk about above, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And when we think about the universe, all of the fathers understood the human being as the high point of creation. Right. So the human being is the crown, right? The crown of creation. The high point of creation. So the above language, which is interesting, we talk about it in terms of up, but what we'll find for Paul is the above is also within, because the high point of the human being, the high point, the place of greatest glory for the human being, is not so much the body, but it's the spirit. Right? It's the heart. It's this inward part. That's the high point of the human being. And the human being is the high point of all creation. So the above is, we would say, the highest point in all of the universe is actually the inwardmost point of the human being. Yeah.
So, and think about it this way. So, in the Old Testament, Mount Zion, where the temple was built, was often called the highest of the mountains. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, it's actually just kind of a big hill. It's not the highest mountain even in the area. So that wasn't literal language, right? But there was idea that this is the high point. This is where earth and heaven touch. And we know from the New Testament that the ancient temple was really just sort of an image of what the human being is meant to be as the temple of Jesus Christ. So as you said, so we are in a sense the highest mountain of creation, and our highest peak is the heart. So there's this language of above.
So when he says seek things, he says, so if you have been raised with Christ, again, there's that image of raising up, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God.
So let's talk about seated at the right hand of God, because that's super interesting.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Yes.
In ancient churches, and many of the churches in the East to this day, there's no place to sit, because the idea is when you go to church, you've entered heaven. And there's an old Jewish and Christian tradition, which is this, as odd as it sounds, and that is this, that angels don't have knees. Because in the ancient Middle Eastern world, there's two ways you worship, either standing or flat on your face. There's no need for knees with angels, whose whole existence is to worship before the face of God. They're either standing or flat on their face. And when you go to worship, you either stand or you're flat on your face. So there's no need for knees. And the idea here is there's only one who is seated in heaven, and that is God.
And that's because Christ, who is seated at the right hand of God, is the only one who's not worshiping.
Yes.
He is being worshipped.
He is being worshipped. Anyone who is seated in heaven is not worshiping but being worshipped, which this puts Christ as enthroned in heaven, in the high place with the Father, where he is worshipped by angels.
So what we have is we have this image of this heavenly throne, where everything is gathered around, all of it's in worship, right? So, and Christ is there not worshiping but being worshiped. So he is divine at the heart of this throne. Now let's talk a little bit about where this throne is, right? What kind of throne? What are we talking about there? Because when I think about throne, I tend to think about a kingly throne. Like we're talking about some palace with, some heavenly palace with some giant chair in it, right? But what would you say is going on here in terms of the throne room or the heavenly throne?
Well, there's a couple things to say. So let's talk about before the giving of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
There's the temple. It's a big, big deal to all ancient Jewish and Christian thinkers that the pattern from the temple is the tabernacle that Moses built. And Moses receives that revelation when he's on Mount Sinai, and he's given a vision of heaven. And he receives... Basically, the understanding is that what God showed Moses was the eternal heavenly temple. And that the tabernacle is patterned on that and in some ways actually participates in that heavenly temple. So let's think about where is a place where angels and humans stand and God is seated? Where on earth can we see that? Where is it on earth as it is in heaven, to use Christ's own words? Well, it's the Holy of Holies. Because what do you have in the Holy of Holies? You have the mighty cherub or seraphim standing but kind of bowed. The high priest goes in there and stands, but there is God's throne, and God's throne there is called the mercy seat. There's no other throne, right? It's an altar. It's the mercy seat, and that is the throne of God. And there are some psalms that speak in parallel between the heavenly temple and the Holy of Holies, where the mercy seat is at. And in fact, if you look at, say, Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah is in the temple and he has a vision of God on his throne, it's not so much that he's transported out of the temple, it's that his eyes are open to see the reality of the temple, right? That the Holy of Holies is heaven on earth, where the angels stand and worship, and the Mighty One is seated on the mercy seat. And what Paul is saying here is that Christ is seated there.
So just to simplify, when I grew up, when I heard about God being on the throne, I thought of this as like a kingly image. Like the throne is just a palace, and God has authorities or sitting on a big chair, sort of like this medieval picture of like a castle and all that. That was my imagination, right? And what we are saying is you got to kind of set that aside. That's not what's really going on here.
Right.
When there's talk about a throne throughout the New Testament, they understand we should be thinking temple. We should be thinking mercy seat, Ark of the Covenant. That's the throne of God. That's the seat upon which God sits, the mercy seat.
The temple is essentially a snapshot of heaven.
Yes.
Of the eternal temple. And the throne we see in there is nothing other than the mercy seat.
So when we hear temple in the New Testament, we should be when we hear throne, we should be thinking temple. We should be thinking mercy seat. And what Paul is saying here is that Christ is seated there, not worshipped. Not worshiping, he's being worshipped, right? In that heavenly temple.
Yes.
Right? But then what we're going to learn is that heavenly temple is actually the way to approach that temple is within my own self. It's not necessarily just sort of out there, outer space or something. We're talking about something that's happening within me.
Yeah. So earlier in Colossians, we talked about use this temple language, like the idea of the glory and the mystery. It's temple language. That's God hidden in the Holy of Holies, and Paul explicitly says that's within. But then later in chapter 3, which we'll get to, when God's on his throne, he reigns or he rules. The place that Paul says Christ rules from is the heart. Right? So he's like, seek the things above to find God reigning in the heart. And there's this really cool thing about going into the heart and going up into the heavens are one and the same thing.
Yes.
So, can I get a little weird here for the New Testament nerds?
Yeah.
I'll try to make it so everybody could follow. So this is an area of research that I pursued in my work. So Paul's getting this from just the broader Jewish culture. People in the ancient Jewish world, they longed to go see God on his throne that the high priest got to see, but they wanted to see it for real, right? Not the symbol, not the shadow of the temple. And there are a group of people, they were of Jewish visionaries. They were called descenders of the chariot throne. And here's the idea. In the Old Testament, we have a few visions of God's throne. And it's always a chariot throne, right? He's right. So think Ezekiel chapter 1, or even think of Elijah being carried off into heaven on the fiery chariot throne. That's God's throne that carries him away. These Jewish religious folks, they wanted very much to see the chariot throne. And so we've got these really weird books they've written and accounts they have of their visions. And what puzzled scholars for a long, long, long time was they would describe ascending up, 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 up into heaven to see the chariot throne. But they called themselves the descenders of the chariot throne. And scholars said, that doesn't make sense.
It should be the ascenders.
The ascenders. They ascend to the throne. Mm-hmm. But the reason is this. What Paul shares with his contemporaries, because other Jewish people, not just Paul, thought this too, they began to understand that the human being is the real temple. So what they would do, these Jewish practitioners, they would emulate the story about Elijah praying. They would put their beard on their chest, and they would do these intense prayer practices. And the question is, well, the issue is they're ascending to heaven by descending into their heart. Mm. Now, we can actually see this in the New Testament. Do you remember in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about one of his visions where he says he goes to the third heaven, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, again, that threefold structure, right? And he says, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. I don't care. And we tend to take that just as, confusion. But the idea is this. When he goes up, up, up into heaven, he's also going down, down, down into himself, into his heart, because that one eternal throne of God is as if there are 2 or 3 doors that open up into that throne room. One is heaven, but one is the heart itself. Mm-hmm. So the up and the down kind of get confused. And I know this is weird, but the payoff is just simply this. That eternal throne where Christ is seated is within, right? Is within.
Right. So when he says, for example, I think this is fascinating. So if we take that context and we use that to understand Paul's words here, he says, seek the things that are above, right? So at that point, we could talk about, he could be just as using the language of descend as much as ascend.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
you could say go into yourself, go into your heart.
Where Christ is.
Because the doorway to things above is actually your heart.
Yes. So he says, and then he says, set your mind on the things that are above, not on the things that are of the earth. So we have this above and below stuff.
Right.
But we could just as easily talk about inward versus outward.
Yes, because what is it that is what is it that is ours that is of the earth? Well, our own outer court. The body.
Yes, and then he says, and then this again is interesting. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And I think this is wonderful imagery because, again, the hidden imagery, if we're thinking temple here, hidden, the mystery, where are things hidden? Well, they're hidden in the Holy of Holies. That's where you can't see.
Only the high priest can go. And we don't simply have access to it. He says what? That we're there.
In there.
We're in there.
Right.
Our life is hidden in there. So in a sense, right, my life and yours is hidden in my heart and yours.
Yes, with Christ. There's a sense in which, because Christ is on the throne, right, and our life is hidden with Him in the Holy of Holies, with God.
So if something like sexual desires keeps our attention entirely on our earthly parts, we're outside of our heart. Now we don't even know ourselves, because why? Our true self is with Christ in the heart. It's gone through that doorway into heaven. That's where we truly are. So that takes us to that final passage, right? You mentioned your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, who is above, who is within, where our life is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. So there's that temple language, that glory shining. We tend to just run to the end of the world with that. Oh, when Christ comes back and everybody sees it and everybody knows that we've got his life and they don't, and we're shown to be right and you're wrong. That's kind of there. But there's also this idea that when in a disciplined way, through prayer and through spiritual disciplines, we go into our heart, we kind of come to see who we are.
Christ is revealed within. And we are revealed with him in that glory.
We don't know who we are until we go into our heart prayerfully, because our life is hidden in there. And so if we spend our whole life indulging in things outside of the heart, then we won't even know who we are. We'll be outside of ourselves.
So there's a sense in which Paul is saying our true self is on that holy throne, and in some sense enthroned with Christ.
In some sense, yes.
In some sense enthroned with Christ on this mercy seat. And therefore, that's where we truly are, and we ought to seek that out. We need to seek out our presence with Christ in that way. And what we need to realize is the things of the body, we have died to those things. Leave those things behind. Turn toward where we truly are.
Yes.
Turn to where our life really is the source of our life, which is Christ himself, and not on this sort of bodily life where it's like, okay, I've got to eat to survive, I've got to procreate. We can get to this kind of stuff, procreate, so the species, like that kind of stuff is actually, we ought to leave that kind of earthly mode of existence behind, right?
In a sense, right? Or to put it in its proper place, because the temple needs an outer court. And it needs to be kept in order, or it's going to fall apart. It's going to die. So we eat to live. We don't live to eat. In marriage, we can get into that. Like sex has a role not simply to procreate for the creation, but also to keep our married lives strong and that kind of unity. But the idea here is sexual sin or gluttony or these things. It's this sort of pulling us out of that inner place where we're just consumed. So let's look at the list again, right, of the bad things, verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly. Fornication, which is sexual sin. Impurity. Passions, right? Those things about our body, the anger, the desires, those things that we talked about in our first episode, put that to death. Evil desire and greed, and these things are idolatry, right? So it's not that eating is bad. It's not that sexual desire or even sex itself is bad. Not at all. In its proper place, it's great. It's part of that temple. But that temple exists for us to go into the Holy of Holies, for us to go into the heart. And one of the things why there is a concern with these types of things is not because it makes God mad if we have the wrong kind of pleasures, but they're the kinds of things that pull our mind, as Paul says, put your mind on things above, things that pull our mind down to these earthly things so that we cannot enter into the heart, the place that is above.
Right. It's almost like it's almost as if we had the temple, which is ourselves, and rather than being directed toward the Holy of Holies and attempting to approach the throne of God in that sense, we're turned to something else, like on the outer courts, and we are worshiping that. That's the idea, that there's idolatry there, that our attention is drawn to those things, the buying and selling or whatever that's happening on the outer courts.
And the outer court isn't bad. It's just not where you bow down before God. You don't see God in the outer court. The outer court is maintained, kept in order, so that you can enter into the Holy of Holies and know Christ and your own life. So again, not bad, but you keep it in all exists for the sake of spiritual life in the heart.
So let's talk about this a little bit in terms of lust and what our culture has done with lust. I mean, to be honest, we've talked about this before in the past. American culture, definitely glamorized sex. We've glamorized sexual pleasure. We've glamorized sexual activity to the point where, I was just saying the other day, like, if you go to even to other cultures across the world, the body isn't nearly as sexualized as it is in our culture. Like, for example, my parents are European, and I spent a fair amount of time over there. And you might have the naked body. You have naked bodies in shows on TV, or there's nude beaches and all that kind of stuff. Much more prevalent over there, but it's less sexualized. Right. It's actually, you'll see a body, if you ever sometimes you may watch a foreign film or something, there's a naked person and you're not attracted to them at all, because there's no, like, it's not been glamorized and sexualized. It's just a body that's naked. Well, in the American culture, of course, when you see a naked body and when it's shown on in media, film, and all this kind of, it's extremely sexualized, extremely glamorized. And so we have this very glamorized understanding of sex, right, to where our attention, it's almost like we give it tons of power in our life. We sort of lift it up and we want to say, well, you know what? It's either indulge, try to have as much sexual pleasure as you can, or what Christians have often done in the purity culture, say, this is this wonderful thing and you have to be careful with it, right? But once you treat it the right way, then it's this wonderful thing and you have this sex life that's just amazing, and your life is both sides. We kind of give it this attention.
Yeah, both sides give it the power.
Give it this power and this attention that really it ought not to have. I mean,
well, think about this. I mean, it's a uniquely American thing that we're scandalized by breastfeeding in public. Why? Because we can't think of the body as anything other than sexualized.
Right.
All over the rest of the world, that's not an issue. People understand, like, bodies in certain contexts have a sort of sexual valence, but not always, right? Or even if always it's not with that power.
So what we have, I think, in our culture, I was using this example yesterday, was, like, if you think 100 years ago, Little House on the Prairie, like, mom and dad, like, you have to procreate, but, it's how do I say it? It's not glamorous, right? I mean,
I just had different thoughts watching that show.
It's not glamorous, man. Like, for most of like human history, people have done it, and it hasn't been this like extremely glamorous thing. It's part of life, right? Yeah. But in our particular culture, we've sort of injected it with all of this glamour and attention and focus, right? And such that in our culture, it's almost like we don't even know what to do with this. It's the forbidden fruit. We kind of give it this power, right? That it hasn't had in the past, nearly as much attention.
I mean, it's always been a problem for humanity, but
right.
Again, like, look at Evagrius. He didn't think it was nearly as dangerous as pride or despair or these kinds of things. And actually, he thought giving sexuality this power actually leads to despair and depression and sadness. But we'll get into that later in the season.
I guess what I'm just trying to say is if we took a more biblical view of it, or a Pauline view of it, the lust and sexual desire, it's an earthly thing, which doesn't mean it's inherently like this is an evil thing, but it's really our life that's hidden with Christ and God is in fact the root of where our glory is. We've placed earthly things, we've invested it with glory. Yes. When he's just saying this is a lesser thing.
Right.
What we ought to be seeking or setting our minds on, our focus ought to be on this glory which is hidden with Christ in God. That should be the root of our desire.
It's the outer court of the temple, which has a role and is good, but if it becomes your God, you need to slay that God. And I want to talk about this for a second, because Evagrius, of course, is celibate, and he's writing to other celibate men. I want to talk just a minute about marriage, because we're married. I think many of the people who listen to our podcast are married, and talk about why sexual fidelity matters in this context, right? And that's because I'm sorry if I'm switching away from where you want to go, but I think we should talk about this. I have this pet peeve about our preaching in our churches about marriage. We preach about what your commitment to Jesus will do for your marriage, and I think that's actually backwards. I think marriage is a gift given to us whereby we move into the life of Jesus Christ. And here's why. Marriage is difficult, right? Fidelity, loyalty to one person is hard. It's both in that sexual relationship where you're more likely to, the first time in your life you think there's someone who's more important to me than I am to myself. And it's usually a kind of sexual desire that awakens that in us. It kind of makes us like Jesus in that way. But it's also as you get married and that relationship gets especially close and intimate that it becomes difficult. And it's in that unique relationship where, on the one hand, you're invited to a self-giving love, which is the life of God hidden in the heart, but also where, if your eyes are open, you can be taught where and how you're earthly. Mm-hmm. Right? Marriage can be a great training ground for going into the heart, because it's in marriage that I find out am I impatient? I think we live sometimes professional Christian lives or just devout Christian lives, and we talk to people a certain way, like, I want to be patient, I want to be loving, I want to not be angry. Well, here's the question. How's that playing out in that marriage relationship? I want to be faithful to God. Okay, well, it's in your fidelity to your spouse that you learn if you're a faithful person. It's in your patience with your spouse that you learn if the peace of Christ is reigning in your heart. We learn our limits there, even as we're attracted to a kind of intimacy that's only born in the heart. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the reasons why things like pornography and these kinds of things that inflame sexual desire and make it harder for us to be faithful in marriage, that matters. Mm-hmm. Because it doesn't allow us to have that sexual relationship we have in marriage play that role mm-hmm. of leading us into the heart where Christ is. Mm-hmm. We must be humble, patient people capable of self-giving love to enter into the Holy of Holies within us where our life is hidden. And that plays out primarily for married people in that marriage relationship. Mm-hmm. So the reason we don't want to inflame sexual desire or dissatisfaction in our married lives is because it's there more than in any other relationship that training we've been talking about mm-hmm. happens. It's where our eyes can be open to our limitations and where we're kind of drawn out of ourselves in a relationship. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to give that kind of practical sense here of contextualizing marriage here. So this is why fornication's a problem. It's not just desire God doesn't want you pleasure God doesn't want you to have. It's so that the marriage relationship can be about that great mystery, which is Christ in you.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for 1 second, just about specifically in terms of lust too, because I think what we find increasingly with our society today, because our exposure to sexual material, primarily through media, online, all that kind of stuff, starts very young, and it's very prevalent, is our sexual lives. We tend to find that our sexual relationships with others are increasingly attempting to model or attain what we see, mm-hmm. like through, movies, pornographic material, or whatever. So sexual relations between two people, let's say, we find this increasingly. We were talking about this the other day. Oftentimes, it's really pressed upon young women too, that they are supposed to fulfill this male desire to have these certain kinds of exotic sexual encounters and this very glamorized picture of sexuality. We find ourselves chasing after this fantasized ideal, mm-hmm. and the actual living relationship that you're talking about is supposed to be pressed into or in the service of that.
Right.
Rather than sexual relations properly situated within the context of a kind of mutual love and fidelity, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm trying to say is your point about training and marriage as being this way of finding out what it means to love as Christ loved and to receive mm-hmm. love as Christ loved. We find that twisting that occurs, especially in our culture today with lust, by turning us outward towards a sort of fantasized ideal, an unrealistic ideal, mm-hmm. in some sense, our own sexual lives, even sexual lives between husband and wife, is chasing that, right? Is chasing the most glamorized, exotic version of sexual experience, rather than sex bound up within an attempt to love one another truly, receive love truly, as a way of approaching the divine throne. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, it's training. If someone's sexual attention is not capable of a fidelity to their spouse, what are the chances that attention is subtle enough to go into the heart and see Christ? It's not about limiting. It's not about, ooh, no, nasty. It has everything to do with how married life, sexual life, is part of the temple that we are, that needs to be properly ordered if we're to go in. So, yeah, exactly. So, I don't know. I hope we didn't lose people with the weird stuff about Jewish mysticism.
I think it's awesome. Yeah.
But that was for the New Testament nerds out there. But hopefully, we, say something. Ask us a question, whether on the Facebook page, some of you go to our church. Come to us if we just puzzled you, but putting sexual desire in the context of spiritual life, of being a temple, where, as Paul says, have your minds go above, where you find Christ reigning in the heart. That's where this all makes sense. This is why we should seek these things. So, as
the satisfaction of ultimately our desire,
yes,
right? Is that's where we're leading. So hopefully our experience, reading Evagrius can help us, train us to put that, not to say it's bad, but to put it in its proper place.
It's the outer court of the temple. That's not where we bow down. We bow down in the heart. You put the outer court in order so you can go into the heart and bow down.
We'd love to talk to you guys more about this on our discussion group, because we've got a bunch of weird ideas about sex in our culture and a lot of confusion. I have to say, it doesn't seem like my general opinion is, as human beings, we haven't figured this thing out.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. This should all be approached with compassion and mercy and non-judgment.
Right.
Always, right?
Yeah.
It's the mercy seat we're headed towards, where the only one given the right to judge came to us and said, I do not judge you.
Right.
So that should be remembered.
Yeah. So raise up your questions on the Facebook discussion group, and we'll slog through the complexity of sexual desire in relationship to
Awesome.
Jesus.
I'm happy we invited people to do that.
So do that, and we'll see you next week, right?
Like, comment, share, talk it up.
Thank you.